Her stepmother forced her to serve at her sister's wedding. The most powerful duke was watching, and one mistake could get her killed. He did not whisper it. He did not murmur it or breathe it or shape it like a question. He said it the way other men said amen, as though it were the only truth he had ever believed in. And then he set down his glass, rose from his chair, and walked straight toward her. She was carrying a tray of champagne. She was wearing a servant's dress. She was invisible to every person in that room except him. Picture this. A ballroom filled with candlelight, the rustle of silk gowns, the clink of crystal, the low hum of a string quartet threading through laughter, and the smell of hothouse roses. And in the corner, a woman who has been overlooked for so long she has learned to make herself small. She does not know that across the room, the most powerful man in England is watching her, and has been for years. Tonight we are talking about a girl named Sabina Stillwell. A wedding built on lies, and a secret so lethal that one wrong step will not just ruin her reputation, it will get her killed. No. You think you know where this is going. You think you have seen the evil stepmother before. The cold ambition, the missing inheritance, the daughter pushed to the margins. You think you have this story mapped. You do not. Because the evil stepmother in this story does not just steal. She erases. She forges. She poisons. And by the time Sabina is standing in that ballroom with a hidden ledger pressed against her ribs and a duke walking toward her through the crowd, the body count is already at 12, and her name has just been added to the list. Let me take you back. To the year 1847. To a manor house in Derbyshire where a girl who was born to inherit everything was stripped of her name, her rooms, her future, and forced to serve champagne at her own sister's wedding to the very people who destroyed her. This is where her story ends. And this right here is where it begins. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The spring of 1829 was the kindest England had seen in a decade. That was the year Sabina Stillwell arrived in the world, red-faced and furious, and already, her father said, arguing with the midwife. Thomas Stillwell was not a man of titles. He had no coat of arms, no ancestral portrait gallery, no seat in any house that mattered to the aristocracy. What he had was a mind like a steel trap, a warehouse in Derby filled with imported silks, and a laugh so large it embarrassed his business partners and delighted everyone else. He adored his wife with the kind of love that made practical men nervous. And he adored his daughter with the kind of love that leaves a mark. Sabina grew up in the spaces between ledgers. She learned to count on her father's knee, her small finger tracing columns of numbers while he explained margins and interest and the quiet power of a well-kept account. She learned that numbers do not lie, that they hold their shape under pressure, that a figure recorded in ink cannot be charmed or bullied or persuaded into becoming something it is not. Her mother taught her other things. How to move through a room so that people felt at ease. How to read the temperature of a silence before it became an argument. How to be warm without being weak. She was 7 years old when her mother stopped getting out of bed. The illness came quietly, the way the worst things always do. A cough in October, a fever in November, a stillness by December that settled over the house like snowfall and did not melt. Sabina would sit outside the bedroom door in the evenings and listen to her father's voice, low and steady, reading aloud the way her mother used to read to her. She did not understand then that he was saying goodbye. Her mother died on a Tuesday. The tulips had just come up in the garden. Sabina always hated tulips after that. Her father grieved the way mountains grieve, without visible movement, but changed permanently beneath the surface. He threw himself into the business. He worked through the nights. He came home to kiss his daughter's forehead and leave again before she woke. And in that gap, that quiet, yawning, grief-shaped gap between a mourning man and his lonely daughter, a woman appeared. Her name was Lady Constance Vane. She was beautiful in the architectural way of a building designed to impress rather than welcome. She spoke softly and dressed impeccably and looked at Thomas Stillwell with an attention that a grieving man, starved of warmth, mistook for devotion. They were married within the year. Sabina stood at the wedding in a white dress her father had commissioned and felt, for the first time in her short life, the specific chill of being looked at by someone who was already calculating what you were worth, and whether you were in the way. She was 8 years old. She did not yet have the words for what she felt. She would learn them soon enough. It did not happen all at once. That was the thing no one would have believed, had Sabina ever tried to explain it. There was no single morning she woke to find herself a servant. No dramatic decree, no door slammed in her face, no moment clean enough to point to and say, there. That was when it changed. It happened in increments, the way a tide erases a shoreline. So gradually that by the time you notice the land is gone, you have already forgotten what it looked like. First it was the bedroom. Constance had a daughter of her own, Miriam, 2 years younger than Sabina, with her mother's architectural beauty and her mother's talent for wanting things that belonged to other people. Miriam needed more space, it was explained. The east-facing room caught better morning light, it was explained. Sabina's room was larger than was strictly necessary for a girl her age, it was explained. Sabina moved to the room at the end of the corridor without argument. She had learned already that argument cost more than it won. Then it was the dining table. Then the piano. Then the lessons, the music teacher let go, the governess quietly replaced with one who had instructions, Sabina understood later, to teach Miriam and consider her own salary well earned. By the time Sabina was 13, she had been moved to the attic, on the grounds that the corridor room was needed for a guest who never came. By the time she was 15, she was eating in the kitchen. By the time she was 16, the kitchen staff had stopped being surprised to see her there, which meant the transformation was complete. She was invisible. And invisibility, she discovered, had its own particular power. The house spoke differently when it thought no one of consequence was listening. Cook talked freely to the scullery girl about the household accounts, about the creditors who came to the back door with confusion on their faces and left with nothing. The footmen gossiped about the men who visited Constance in her private sitting room, men who were not solicitors, though they carried the leather cases of solicitors. The housemaid, who liked Sabina in the uncomplicated way of someone who had no reason not to, once showed her a letter she had found, and signed, the handwriting sharp as a knife's edge, tucked beneath Constance's vanity drawer. Sabina could not read all of it, but she read enough. She began quietly to keep her own ledger. Small, cloth-covered, hidden inside the hollow back of a picture frame she kept in the attic. Numbers, names, dates, everything she heard from the shadows, everything that did not add up. Her father had taught her that numbers do not lie, and the numbers in Constance's household were lying constantly, to everyone, about everything. Sabina wrote it all down. She did not yet know what she would do with it. She only knew that the truth, like a good account, needed to be kept somewhere safe. Owen Bricker did not look like a man who investigated anything. That was, of course, the point. He looked like what he was on paper. The Duke of Blackwell, 31 years old, heir to one of the oldest titles in England, possessed of a jaw that portrait painters requested twice and a reputation that cleared rooms without effort. He wore his authority the way other men wore overcoats. Naturally. Without apparent thought. As though he had been born already fitted for it, which, in the technical sense, he had. Society knew certain things about him. That he sat on 3 Crown committees and spoke on none of them publicly, which made politicians nervous in the specific way that silent, observant men always make loud ones nervous. that he had declined 4 marriage proposals in 6 years, each from families whose fathers had quietly celebrated and whose daughters had quietly wept, that he kept a townhouse in London and an estate in Northumberland and travelled between them on a schedule that no one, including his own secretary, could predict. What society did not know was that Owen Bricker had spent the better part of a decade building a case that the Crown's own legal apparatus was too compromised, too slow, or too afraid to pursue itself. It had begun with a merchant's death in Derby. A man named Thomas Stillwell, recorded in the county register as having abandoned his estate and dependents in the autumn of 1843. No body. No note. No credible witness to his departure. Only a wife left behind to manage his affairs, a wife who had, within 3 months of his disappearance, liquidated his warehouses, settled his debts selectively, and begun a quiet campaign of financial decimation against every man who had ever been owed money by the Stillwell estate. 12 creditors. 12 deaths across 4 years. Each one ruled natural. Each one impeccably timed. Owen had found the pattern the way he found most things, by reading what other men considered too tedious to examine. Probate records. Burial registers. The dry, overlooked arithmetic of inherited debt. He had followed the thread through 3 counties and 2 law firms before it led him back always to one name. Constance Stillwell. But a name was not evidence. And evidence, in a case built this carefully, would not be found in any document Constance controlled. It would be found in the original Stillwell accounts, the merchant's own records, kept in a private cipher that Thomas had apparently taught only one other person before he vanished. His daughter. Owen had known about Sabina Stillwell for 4 years. He had read her father's letters, interviewed the surviving household staff, traced the slow geography of her disappearance within her own home. He knew she was alive. He knew she was inside that house. He knew, with the particular certainty of a man who had spent years learning how Constance operated, that Sabina's survival was not an oversight. It was a loose end Constance had not yet found the right moment to tie off. The wedding, Owen had calculated, would be that moment, which was why he had accepted the invitation. She had not meant to be in the study that night. That was the thing about being invisible. It occasionally made you careless. When you had spent years moving through a house unnoticed, you stopped calculating the risk of each room. You stopped checking corridors before you entered them. You became, without meaning to, overconfident in your own erasure. Sabina had gone for the candle stub she kept on the study windowsill, the one the housemaid left for her when the attic lamp ran dry. It was 11:30. The house was supposed to be asleep. The wedding was 3 days away, and Constance had been running the staff into exhaustion with preparation since dawn. No one, Sabina had reasoned, would be in the study at this hour. Constance was in the study at this hour. Sabina stopped in the doorway 1 second before Constance looked up, and pressed herself flat against the wall in the corridor with the practiced stillness of a woman who had made an art form of not being seen. She did not breathe. She listened. The scratch of a pen. The soft thud of a ledger closing. Then another opening. Then her stepmother's voice, low and precise, speaking to someone Sabina could not see from the corridor's angle. A man, by the weight of the silence he occupied, someone Constance did not need to perform for. The last 2 require his signature. Use the Harwick notation. He always pressed harder on the H. The ink should be dry before morning. A pause. Papers moving. And the girl? The man asked. After the wedding, Constance said, with the same tone she used to discuss linen changes. There will be enough confusion. These things look different in crowds. Sabina stood in the dark corridor and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She did not run. Running made sound. Instead she moved backward, inch by inch, the way she had learned to move through this house, weightlessly, apologetically, like a thing that knew it had no right to take up space. She reached the kitchen stairs. She descended them in darkness, one hand on the wall. She did not go to the attic. She went to the loose stone behind the kitchen hearth where she kept the cloth-covered ledger, and she sat on the cold floor beside it, and she opened it, and she began to turn back through years of careful entries. The names, the dates, the visitors, the debts that vanished too cleanly, the creditors who died too conveniently. And she found it. The entry she had written 3 years ago without fully understanding it. A note in her father's hand. Not hers. A single page she had tucked inside the back cover when she found it slipped beneath his old desk blotter. A list of signatures. Practice signatures. All of them his. All of them in Constance's handwriting. Her father had not disappeared. He had been erased, the same way Sabina had been erased, methodically, incrementally, and by the same careful hand. The difference was that Thomas Stillwell had not survived it. The morning of the wedding arrived the way executioners arrive, punctually and without sympathy. Sabina had not slept. She had spent the hours between midnight and dawn sitting with her ledger, adding the new entries in her smallest handwriting, pressing the facts into the page with the focused calm of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford. By the time the kitchen began to stir and cook started barking orders into the gray pre-dawn, Sabina had already tied the ledger flat against her ribs with a length of muslin, tucked it beneath her uniform, and decided 3 things. She would not run before she had spoken to someone who could act on what she knew. She would not speak to anyone who could carry word back to Constance. And she would not die in this house. The guest list had been read aloud by Constance at breakfast 2 days prior. 43 names delivered in ascending order of social importance, each one accompanied by a brief assessment of their usefulness. Sabina had stood at the sideboard with a coffee pot and memorized every name without appearing to listen, which was a skill she had been perfecting since she was 9 years old. Owen Bricker, Duke of Blackwell, had been the 43rd name. The last one read. The one Constance had delivered with a particular flatness, the tone of a woman who found something useful and something threatening in the same breath and had not yet decided which feeling to honor. Sabina had not known then what she knew now about the Duke. She had known only that his name sat differently in the room than the others. That cook had crossed herself quietly. That even the footmen had straightened their posture at the mention of it. She understood, by the time his carriage arrived at 2:30, why. He stepped out of it with no performance whatsoever. No adjustment of cuffs, no pause for effect, no acknowledgement of the small assembly of staff lined at the entrance. He simply arrived, tall, dark-coated, moving with the economical precision of a man who did not waste motion, and the day reorganized itself around him without being asked. Constance greeted him at the door with her most architectural smile. He received it with courteous brevity and said nothing that could be quoted. 2 hours later, Sabina was assigned to the ballroom floor. She understood immediately that this was punishment, the most visible post, the most exposure, the most opportunity for Constance's man to track her movements. She accepted the tray without expression and moved into the candlelight with her eyes on the floor and the ledger pressed flat against her heartbeat. She had not expected, when she finally looked up, to find him already watching her. Not glancing. Not noticing. Watching. With the quiet, absolute attention of a man who had been waiting for precisely this moment and intended to waste none of it. Sabina looked down at her tray. Her hands, she noted with distant pride, did not shake. But it was close. It was Miriam's laugh that did it. Not the collision, though there was a collision, a wedding guest turning too quickly with too much champagne already in him, his elbow catching the edge of Sabina's tray with the cheerful violence of a man who did not register servants as objects capable of being struck. That was the mechanics of it. But it was Miriam's laugh, bright and performative, aimed directly at Sabina from across the room where she stood radiant in ivory silk, that caused Sabina's hands to fail her. The tray tilted. 2 glasses fell. The sound of crystal on marble was, in the particular acoustics of a ballroom momentarily between musical sets, extraordinarily loud. The room turned. Constance was at Sabina's side before the last shard stopped moving. Not rushing. Constance never rushed, it was one of her most effective qualities, but arriving with a speed that suggested she had been watching for exactly this. Her hand closed around Sabina's wrist beneath the guise of steadying her, and the pressure of it, hidden from the room by the angle of their bodies, was precise and deliberate and painful. Her voice, when she spoke, was warm with social apology. "How dreadful! Do forgive us." And then, quieter, in the register that only Sabina could hear, "You will come to my sitting room after the toasts. We have something to discuss." It was not an invitation. Sabina knew what came after conversations in Constance's sitting room. She had watched it happen to others. The creditor from Nottingham who had come asking questions and left looking diminished. The solicitor's clerk who had visited twice and not visited a third time. She stood very still and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because Constance's grip had tightened, and because the room was still watching with the delighted discomfort of people who have witnessed a social wound and are grateful it wasn't theirs. And then the watching stopped, because something more interesting had occurred. Owen Bricker had stood up. He crossed the ballroom floor with the same unhurried precision with which he did everything. No performance, no announcement, and stopped beside them with a glass of champagne extended toward Sabina as though the gesture were the most natural thing in the room. "I believe I requested this dance," he said. The words were addressed to Sabina. The implication was addressed to everyone else. Constance released her wrist. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room recalibrating. Owen did not look at Constance. He did not look at the broken glass or the staring guests or the sister whose laugh had started it all. He looked only at Sabina, with an expression that was publicly unreadable, and privately. He danced the way he did everything else, with complete economy of movement and absolute control. No flourish. No performance. Just the correct steps executed with the kind of precision that told Sabina he had learned dancing the same way he had learned everything, as a tool to be mastered rather than an art to be enjoyed. His hand at her waist was formal. Appropriate. The distance between them precisely what the room required. What the room could not hear was his voice. "You have something that belongs to your father," he said. Not a question. Spoken into the middle distance above her left shoulder. His expression carrying the pleasant neutrality of a man making social conversation about nothing in particular. "And you have had it long enough to understand what it means." Sabina kept her own eyes forward. Her face composed. Years of invisibility had given her this, the ability to have an entirely different conversation behind the one her features were showing. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." He turned her smoothly through the corner of the floor. "I am not here to take it from you. I am here because Constance has known about it for 6 weeks, which means tonight was always going to be the night she moved. The wedding was her cover. The confusion of a large gathering. These things look different in crowds." The phrase landed on Sabina like cold water. These things look different in crowds. The exact word she had heard through the study door 2 nights ago. She missed half a step. His hand steadied her without drawing attention to it. The adjustment so subtle that no watching eye would have caught it. "You were in the house," she said. "I had someone in the house," he corrected quietly. "For 2 years. Long enough to know that you have been building a record of everything Constance has done since she arrived. Long enough to know that your father's cipher is the only thing that unlocks the original accounts. Long enough to know that without you the case dies. With you, 12 families get justice and Constance Stillwell stands before a crown tribunal before spring." The music swelled around them. Across the room, Sabina caught Constance watching. Not with alarm, not yet, but with the careful recalibration of a woman updating her calculations in real time. "There are 2 men by the east corridor," Owen continued. "They are not wedding security. Do not let either of them bring you anything. Do not go near the east corridor. And whatever you do—" He turned her again, and for just a fraction of a second his eyes met hers directly, and the public neutrality in them dropped like a mask slipping, and what was underneath it was urgent and certain and completely unambiguous. "Do not drink the wine." The music ended. He stepped back. He bowed with courteous formality. Sabina curtsied with a steadiness she did not feel. The room applauded the quartet. No one had heard a word. But Constance, Sabina noticed as she turned away, had stopped smiling. She understood this with a clarity that surprised her. Asking a single urgent question. "Do you trust me enough to take one step?" Sabina set down the tray. She took the step. She should not have gone near the library. She knew this. Owen had said East Corridor, and she had heard him clearly, and she had every intention of staying in the ballroom's candlelit center where witnesses were plentiful and Constance's men could not move without being seen. She had a plan. It was not a sophisticated plan, but it was a plan, and it required only that she remain visible until Owen could position himself to act. Then the housemaid found her. Young, frightened, pressing a folded note into Sabina's hand with the trembling urgency of someone who had been told that lives depended on the delivery. The note was in Cook's handwriting. Sabina knew every loop of it, and it said only that something had been found in the East Wing that Sabina needed to see before the toasts began. She told herself it was probably nothing. She went anyway because the alternative was standing in a ballroom wondering, and wondering, she had learned, was its own kind of paralysis. The library door closed behind her with a sound like a full stop. Constance was already inside. She was standing beside the fire with a glass of red wine she had no intention of drinking, wearing the expression she reserved for conversations where the outcome had already been decided. Beside her stood the man from the East Corridor, broad, patient, occupying his corner of the room with the particular stillness of someone paid to wait and then act quickly. "Sit down, Sabina," Constance said. Sabina did not sit down. What followed was not a speech. Constance was too intelligent for speeches. It was instead a series of quiet statements delivered in the tone of someone reading a balance sheet. Accurate, dispassionate, final. That the ledger had been known about for some time. That its location had been narrowed to Sabina's person. That the cipher protecting it had proved, despite considerable effort and the application of considerable resources, completely impenetrable. "Which brings us," Constance said, "to the only remaining problem." She meant Sabina. She meant the fact that the ledger without Sabina was a collection of meaningless notations, columns of invented symbols that Thomas Stillwell had constructed specifically so that only his daughter, tutored in the private language of his own devising since she was 5 years old, could translate them into the account entries that would damn Constance completely. The ledger was not just evidence. It was evidence that could only be unlocked by a single living person. Which was why Sabina had not been disposed of sooner. She had been, in the coldest possible sense, kept. And which was why, now that Constance had run out of alternatives and time, the keeping was over. Sabina pressed her back against the door and felt the ledger beneath her ribs and understood with absolute clarity that she had walked into this room carrying the only thing that could save 12 families, and the only thing that would certainly get her killed. The man by the fireplace took one step forward. The door behind Sabina did not open. The door opened anyway. Not from Sabina's side. From the corridor, smoothly, without force, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 20 minutes positioning people on the other side of it and was now simply collecting what he had come for. Owen Bricker stepped into the library followed by 2 men whose coats bore no livery Sabina recognized, and whose bearing was not that of wedding guests or household staff or private security. They moved with the specific unhurried efficiency of men operating under Crown warrant, which was precisely what they were. Owen looked at Constance the way he looked at everything, with complete stillness and no performance whatsoever. "Lady Stillwell," he said, "you will want to put down the glass." Constance did not put down the glass immediately. She was, to the last, a woman who needed to believe she still held the better position. She looked at Owen with the architectural smile and began the sentence that began with, "I think there has been some misunderstanding." "There has not," Owen said. He produced a document from his inner coat pocket and set it on the library table with the same quiet precision with which he had set down his champagne glass in the ballroom, the gesture of a man who has made a decision that cannot be unmade. The crown seal was visible from where Sabina stood. So were the signatures below it. Constance looked at the document. Something in her face, not broke exactly, because Constance was not a woman who broke, but settled. Like a building accepting, finally, the weight it could no longer bear. The man from the east corridor did not take another step. He had read the room correctly. What followed was efficient and almost entirely without drama, which felt to Sabina like the strangest part of all of it. She had imagined, in the rare moments she had allowed herself to imagine an ending, something louder. Something proportionate to 10 years of accumulated wrong. Instead there was the quiet production of warrants, the brief and formal words exchanged between Owen's men and the 2 hired guards, Constance's wrists and the cold click of restraint, and then the sound of the library emptying until only Owen and Sabina remained. The fire had burned low. Outside the door the wedding continued, the quartet unaware, the guests unknowing, the champagne still circulating on silver trays through candlelit rooms. Owen turned to face her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the ballroom, not at the gray uniform or the servant's cap or the 10 years of careful erasure, but through all of it directly at the woman underneath, the one who had kept records in the dark, who had survived on mathematics and stubbornness and the refusal to be entirely disappeared. "It's over," he said. Sabina reached up and removed the cap from her hair. It was a small gesture. It took perhaps 2 seconds, but she felt it move through her like the first warm day after a winter that had lasted a decade. The specific extraordinary sensation of being seen fully and finally by someone who had been looking for her for years. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her chin. Outside, somewhere in the candlelit ballroom, a glass was raised for the wedding toast. In the library, quietly and without ceremony, Sabina Stillwell came home. And that is where we leave Sabina Stillwell. Not in the gray wool. Not in the attic. Not carrying a tray through a room full of people who looked straight through her. We leave her in the library doorway, shoulders back, chin lifted, finally, taking up exactly the space she was always owed. If this story found something in you, I want to hear about it. Drop in the comments. What was the moment that got you? Was it the dance? The library? The ledger pressed against her ribs through all of it? Tell me. I read every single one. And if you enjoy emotional, dramatic love stories like this, make sure you like this video, turn on your notification bell and subscribe to this channel. There's so much more coming, and you don't want to miss the next story. Until then, keep your ledger close, trust your numbers, and never, never drink the wine. I'll see you in the next one.